Good evening. All right. Welcome to Ebenezer United Methodist Church on Capitol Hill. I'm Brían Jenkins, and I serve as the pastor of this illustrious institution. On the behalf of Bishop Latrell Miller Easterling, the resident bishop of the Baltimore, Washington, and Peninsula, Delaware Conference of the United Methodist Church, our congregation, we welcome you to Ebenezer United Methodist Church, a sacred space where faith, justice, and the arts converge. We are honored to host a Refutation, a powerful presentation by Theater of War Productions, generously supported by the Greenwall Foundation in celebration of its 75th anniversary in partnership with DC Public Library. For 187 years, at Ebenezer, we have been deeply committed to the intersection of arts and theology in the public square. On this very pulpit is a space where W.E.B. Du Bois once preached. We believe that storytelling, performance, and dialogue have the power to illuminate truth, challenge assumptions, and cultivate healing in our community. Through the creative lens of theater, we engage in the most pressing moral and ethical questions of our time, affirming that art is not merely an expression, but a vehicle for transformation. Tonight's presentation, under the direction of Brían F, is an invitation to wrestle with a complex idea, to listen deeply, to participate in a conversation that is both ancient and urgently relevant. We are grateful for your presence. We encourage you to embrace the experience with an open heart, an open mind, and in this open door. May this gathering inspire thoughtful reflection, meaningful dialogue, and a renewed commitment to justice, the arts, and compassion throughout all the world. Thank you to Theater of War, the Greenwall Foundation, the Baltimore, Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church, my district superintendent, Dr. John C. Cogman, Reverend Elisa Lassiter-Waylu, and Ebenezer on Capitol Hill United Methodist Church, Lincoln Park United Methodist Church, and please remember the words of the founder of the United Methodist Church, John Wesley, who once said, "Do all the good you can for as long as you can." And if that doesn't hit you, make sure that you say what John Lewis once said, "Go and get in some good trouble." We here at Ebenezer are so happy to have you, so let us engage in this rich and robust conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jenkins. It really does feel divinely ordained that we found ourselves coming here to this beautiful historic church. My name is Brían F. I'm Artistic Director of Theater of War Productions. I was introduced to Reverend Jenkins by Reverend Waylu, Alyssa Waylu, who said, "I can introduce you to several pastors, but there's one pastor in town who also happens to be a costume designer." I said, "We'll go with that one." So that's how we got here, by way of her brother-in-law, Keith Waylu, who's on the board of the Greenwall Foundation, and through the generous support of the Greenwall Foundation, which commissioned Theater of War Productions to develop this piece, which we are premiering here with you as our collaborators tonight for the first time, and then tomorrow at Martin Luther King Jr. Library in downtown DC with another audience. Some of you I've heard also have tickets there, so we hope many of you will come back. And we have designs for this to just be the very, very beginning, the dress rehearsal for many performances to come. Theater of War Productions is a theater company, a social impact company in New York City. We're over 18 years old now, and we have more than 40 projects in our repertory that address pressing issues of public health and social justice through the format you're going to experience here tonight, which is through live performances and readings of seminal texts, broadly defined, that serve as table dressing, as a pretext for a conversation that wouldn't have happened otherwise. In our model, the audience is the main character, not just the audience who's physically with us here, but the audience watching on Zoom, the more than 800 people who signed up all over the world to be in dialogue with us here tonight. So during the event, there'll be a performance of 5 texts from 1793, fasten your chin straps, it is actually going to require a lot of the actors, but it's also going to demand quite a bit from you as an audience. And one of the things that we learned in Times Square when we performed an Ibsen play last June is that in the most distracting place on the universe, we could train our consciousness as an audience on something really hard for up to 3 hours and nobody left. So in a beautiful place like this, I have no doubt our consciousness is only going to expand and grow as we sit with these texts from 1793 and contemplate how they, as attributed to Mark Twain, how they rhyme with the present moment. So that's the idea. I'm going to quickly introduce the actors who've come with me. The actors are going to perform the text from 1793, which I'll introduce in just a second. As soon as they're done, we have 7 members of this community who've bravely agreed to get up and be the first to respond. There are panelists, but really they're the first audience members who get a chance to respond, and then everyone else will get a chance too, because as soon as they're done with their gut responses to what they heard and saw in these texts from 1793, I'm going to come out with a microphone and with a microphone runner, and I'm going to ask questions. And since this is the first one, you're going to help define what the questions ultimately are, because it's a work in progress. But I'm going to ask questions and move us through a series of themes, and we'll hear from people here, and we'll hear from people in Australia. We'll hear from people in homeless shelter kitchens. We'll hear from people in their cars, in their bedrooms, watching all over the world. And that never gets old for Theater of War Productions, because the more people we bring into consciousness and dialogue, the more we raise our own consciousness and attention. So that's the idea behind the exercise. Before we get started, I want to thank the Greenwall Foundation. I want to thank Reverend Jenkins and Ebenezer United Methodist Church, Reverend Welu for making the introduction. There'll be many other thanks at the end, but thank you all for showing up on a very cold Friday night in Washington, D.C. Feels like Alaska, not Washington, D.C., but I'm so glad you all made the trek and are here with us in this warm room, made even warmer by your presence. To the far right, Michael Potts, you may know him from The Wire and The Piano Lesson. To his left, Chad Coleman, you may know him from The Wire and The Walking Dead. To his left, Brían O'Byrne. Brían was just in Conclave, for which he just won a Best Supporting Actor Award in Ireland. He also was in $1 Million Baby. He likes to play priests, so he feels comfortable up there. And then to Brían's right is Peter Marks. Peter was the former chief theater critic of the Washington Post, who joined the circus and became an actor with our company. So you too can join the circus if you approach us later and you want a change of career. These 4 actors are part of a much larger company of over 250 actors who, when they get the call, do you want to get up at the crack of dawn and perform Greek tragedy or Shakespeare or O'Neill in a military base or a homeless shelter or a prison, they jump. Because they believe, like I do, there's nothing more important we could do with our craft than we're going to do with you in the next 2 hours, 15 minutes, give or take. We'll see how long it lasts. Think of it as a meeting. Both those of you on Zoom and those of you here, if you need to get up and after the reading, we're going to keep going. But no one's going to police you or tell you how to sit or when to use your cell phone or how to use the bathroom. This is a space where you're invited to be yourselves. And that's the directive, because we're not going to be able to have dialogue if you don't feel like you can be yourself. So briefly, this is what we're going to do. The actors on stage are going to perform a letter, a pamphlet, another pamphlet, a public address / rebuttal, and a revision. We're calling it a refutation. The context that I want to sort of lay out for you all is that in 1793, the city of Philadelphia that August was hit by the yellow fever epidemic. The population of Philadelphia, our nation's burgeoning new capital and the state capital of Philadelphia, was 55,000 people. During the first month or 2 of the epidemic, 20,000 people left the city, as happened in many of other cities during the recent COVID pandemic. Of those 55,000 who were in the city, ultimately 5,000 died of the yellow fever, so roughly 10% of the inhabitants of Philadelphia at the time. At the time, there was one individual named Matthew Carey. He was an Irish publisher, or one might call him a publicist. He was one of the most popular publishers of pamphlets of his time, and pamphlets were like the social media of late 1700s. Matthew Carey wrote from outside the city, based on things he'd heard and had been told, a definitive history of the yellow fever epidemic, in which you'll hear him make claims about what did and didn't happen, and in particular, how the black community that rose to the challenge of serving the white community during the height of the epidemic comported itself. And then you're going to hear a pamphlet by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Absalom Jones, I'm sure many of you know, is the first African American Episcopal priest, and Richard Allen is the founder of the AME Church. They were both leaders in the free black community in the late 1700s. They were both born into slavery. They both purchased their freedom, and they were part of this movement in Philadelphia, this small but growing community, free black community of about 2,000 African Americans living in Philadelphia at that time. There was a prevailing medical theory in the late 1700s, propagated by several prominent physicians out of belief. I don't think out of malice. They also believed that bleeding people at the time was the best remedy for many sicknesses, so it was a rather primitive medicine. But the theory was that people of African descent were immune to the yellow fever, that black people would not succumb to that disease. And so the mayor of Philadelphia, who had put together a kind of provisional government to help run the city while most of the citizens were leaving, he appealed to Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of our founding fathers, who, upon the sort of expertise of a doctor named Leining, who made this argument about black immunity to yellow fever, reassured Absalom Jones and Richard Allen that if they rallied the black community to serve the white community in their moment of need, not only would it improve race relations in Philadelphia and endear them to the white community, but they had an obligation, they both argued, because they would not succumb to it. And of course, that theory proved incorrect. And I don't want to steal the thunder of what happens, but I wanted to give you the context. You'll be hearing from Dr. Rush's letter entreating Jones and Allen to rally the black community to go do this work. You'll hear an advertisement that Jones and Allen placed in a newspaper asking the black community to come out and serve as nurses and undertakers and caregivers during the height of the epidemic. You'll hear Matthew Carey's first edition of his history of the yellow fever epidemic. You'll hear Absalom Jones's and Richard Allen's Refutation. And their Refutation is the first federally copyrighted work by African Americans in this country. And when we say seminal texts, this is a seminal text. Everyone should hear it. Everyone should know about it. So we feel a special honor to be doing it here in Ebenezer tonight. Then you'll hear Matthew Carey's rebuttal and response. That's the arc of it. I'm not going to stop and talk during the performance, so I just wanted to give you the full scope of what you're going to hear over the next hour. I'm going to turn things over to our actors now. Peter will be playing Dr. Benjamin Rush. Brían will be playing Matthew Carey, Chad Absalom Jones, and Michael Richard Allen. Without further ado, I'm turning things over to our actors and our first ever reading of a Refutation.
A letter from Benjamin Rush to Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, Philadelphia, September 2nd, 1793. My dear friends, it has pleased God to visit the city with a malignant and contagious fever, which infects white people of all ranks, but passes by persons of your color. I have therefore taken the liberty of suggesting to you whether this important exemption, which God has granted to you from a dangerous and fatal disorder, does it not lay you under an obligation to offer your services to attend the sick who are afflicted with this malady? Such an act in your society will render you be grateful to the citizens, and I hope pleasing in the light of God, who will see every act of kindness done to creatures whom he calls his brethren, as if done to himself. From your sincere friend, B. Rush.
An advertisement placed by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, co-founders of the Free African Society and the General Advertiser, Philadelphia, September 11th, 1793.
As it is a time of great distress in the city, many people of the black color, under a grateful remembrance of the favor received from the white inhabitants, have agreed to assist them as far as in their power for the nursing of the sick and burial of the dead.
A short account of the malignant fever lately prevalent in Philadelphia, with a statement of the proceedings that took place on the subject in different parts of the United States by Matthew Carey. First edition, November 13th, 1793. The symptoms which characterized the first stage of the fever were, in the greatest number of cases, after a chilly fit of some duration, a quick, tense pulse, hot skin, pain in the head, back, and limbs, flushed countenance, inflamed eye, moist tongue, oppression and sense of soreness at the stomach, especially upon pressure, frequent sick qualms and retchings to vomit without discharging anything except the contents last taken into the stomach, costiveness. And when stools were procured, the first generally showed a defective bile or an obstruction to its entrance into the intestines. But brisk purges generally altered this appearance. These symptoms generally continued with more or less violence from 1 to 3, 4, or even 5 days, and then gradually abating, left the patient free from every complaint except general debility. On the febrile symptoms suddenly subsiding, they were immediately succeeded by a yellow tinge in the opaque cornea, or whites of the eyes, an increased oppression at the precordia, a constant puking of everything taken into the stomach, with much straining accompanied with a hoarse and hollow noise. If these symptoms were not soon relieved, a vomiting of matter resembling coffee grounds in color and consistence, commonly called the black vomit, sometimes accompanied with or succeeded by hemorrhages from the nose, faces, gums, and other parts of the body, a yellowish purple color and putrescent appearance of the whole body, hiccups, agitations, deep and distressed sighing, comatose delirium, and finally, death. When the disease proved fatal, it was generally between the 5th and the 8th days. This was the most usual progress of this formidable disease through its several stages. There were, however, very considerable variations in the symptoms as well as in the duration of its different stages according to the constitution and temperament of the patient, the state of the weather, the manner of treatment. The febrile symptoms, however, as has already been observed, either gave way on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th day, and then the patient recovered, or they were soon after succeeded by a different but much more dangerous train of symptoms by debility, low pulse, cold skin, which assumed a tawny color mixed with purple, black vomiting, hemorrhages, hiccups, anxiety, restlessness, coma. Many who survived the 8th day, though apparently out of danger, died suddenly in consequence of a hemorrhage. While affairs in this deplorable state and people at the lowest ebb of despair, we cannot be astonished at the frightful scenes that were acted, which seem to indicate a total dissolution of the bonds of society in the nearest and dearest connections, who, without horror, can reflect on a husband, married perhaps for 20 years, deserting his wife in the last agony. A wife unfeelingly abandoning her husband on his deathbed, parents forsaking their children, children ungratefully flying from the parents and resigning them to chance, often without an inquiry after their health or safety, masters hurrying off their faithful servants to Bush Hill Hospital, even on suspicion of the fever, and that at a time when, almost like Tartarus, it was open to every visitant, but rarely returned any. Servants abandoning tender and humane masters who only wanted a little care to restore them to help and usefulness, who, I can say, can think of these things without horror. Yet they were often exhibited throughout our city. And such was the force of habit that the parties who were guilty of this cruelty felt no remorse themselves, nor met with the censure from their fellow citizens, which such conduct would have excited at any other period. Indeed, at this awful crisis, so much did self appear to engross the whole attention of many that in some cases not more concern was felt for the loss of a parent, a husband, a wife, or an only child than on other occasions would have been caused by the death of a faithful servant. This kind of conduct produced scenes of distress and misery, of which parallels are rarely to be met with, and which nothing could palliate but the extraordinary public panic and the great law of self-preservation, the dominion of which extends over the whole animated world. Men of affluent fortunes who have given daily employment and sustenance to hundreds have been abandoned to the care of a Negro after their wives, children, friends, clerks, and servants had fled away and left them to their fate. In some cases, at the commencement of the disorder, no money could procure proper attendance. With the poor, the case was, as might be expected, infinitely worse than with the rich. Many of these have perished without a human being to hand them a drink of water, to administer medicines, or to perform any charitable office for them. Various instances have occurred of dead bodies found lying in the streets, of persons who had no house or habitation or could procure no shelter. A man and his wife, once in affluent circumstances, were found lying dead in a bed, and between them was their child, a little infant, who was sucking its mother's breast. How long had they lain thus was uncertain. A woman whose husband had just died of the fever was seized with the pains of parturition and had nobody to assist her, as the women in the neighborhood were afraid to go into the house. She lay for a considerable time in a degree of anguish that will not bear description. At length, she struggled to reach the windows and cried out for assistance. 2 men passing by went upstairs, but they came at too late a stage. She was striving with death, and actually, in a few minutes, expired in their arms. Another woman, whose husband and 2 children lay dead in the room with her, was in the same situation as the former, without a midwife or any other person to aid her. Her cries at the window brought up one of the carters employed by the Committee for the Relief of the Sick. With his assistance, she was delivered a child, which died in a few minutes, as did the mother, who was utterly exhausted by her labor, by the disorder, and by the dreadful spectacle before her, and thus lay in one room no less than 5 dead bodies, an entire family carried off within a few hours. Instances have occurred of respectable women who, in their lying in, have been obligated to depend on their maidservants for assistance, and some have had none but from their husbands. Some of the midwives were dead, and others had left the city. A servant girl belonging to a family in this city in which the fever had prevailed was apprehensive of danger and resolved to remove to a relation's house in the country. She was, however, taken sick on the road and returned to town where she could find no person to receive her. One of the guardians of the poor provided a cart and took her to the almshouse, into which she was refused admittance. She was brought back, but the guardian could not procure her a single night's lodging, and in fine, after every effort made to provide her shelter, she absolutely expired in the cart. This occurrence took place before Bush Hill Hospital was opened. To relate all the frightful cases of this nature that occurred would fill a volume. To pass over them wholly would have been improper. To dwell on them longer would be painful. Let these few, therefore, suffice. Rarely has it happened that so large a proportion of the gentlemen of the faculty have sunk beneath the labors of their very dangerous profession as on this occasion. In little more than a month, exclusive of medical students, no less than 10 physicians have been swept off. Hardly one of the practicing doctors that remained in the city escaped sickness. Some were 3, 4, and 5 times confined. To the clergy, it has likewise proved very fatal. Exposed in the exercise of the last duties to the dying to equal danger with the physicians, it is not surprising that so many of them have fallen. 6 clergymen have been in the greatest danger from this disorder, but they have all recovered. Among the women, the mortality has not by any means been so great as among the men, nor among the old and infirm as among the middle-aged and robust. To tipplers and drunkards, and to men who lived high and were of corpulent habit of body, this disorder was very fatal. Of these, many were seized, and the recoveries were very rare. To the Fiel de joie, it has been equally fatal. The wretched, debilitated state of their constitutions rendered them an easy prey to this dreadful disorder, which very soon terminated their miserable career. It has been dreadfully destructive among the poor. It is very probable that at least 7/8 of the number of dead were of that class. The inhabitants of the dirty houses have severely expiated their neglect of cleanliness and decency by the numbers of them that have fallen sacrifices. Whole families in such houses have sunk into one silent, undistinguishing grave. The mortality in confined streets, small alleys, closed houses, debarred of free circulation of air, has exceeded in a great proportion that in the large streets and well-aired houses. In some of the alleys, 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole of the inhabitants are no more. In 30 houses, the whole number in Pewter Platter Alley, 32 people died. And in Market Street, in 170 houses, only 39. The streets in the suburbs that had the benefit of the country air, especially towards the west part of the city, have suffered little. Of the wide, airy streets, none lost so many people as Arch near Water Street, which may be accounted for by its proximity to the original seat of the disorder. It is to be particularly remarked that in general, the more remote the streets were from Water Street, the less they experienced of the calamity. From the effects of this order, the French, settled in Philadelphia, have been in a very remarkable degree exempt. To what this may be owing is a subject of deserving particular investigation. By some, it has been ascribed to their despising the danger, but though this may have had some effect, it will not certainly account for it altogether, as it is well known that many of the most courageous persons in Philadelphia have been among its victims. By many of the French, the prevalence and mortality of the disorder have been attributed to the vast quantities of crude and unwholesome fruits brought to our markets and consumed by all classes of people. The effect of fear in predisposing the body for this and other disorders and increasing the malignance when taken is well known. The following exception to the general rule, for the truth of which I pledge myself, is curious and interesting. A young woman whose fears were so very prevalent as not only to render her unhappy from the commencement of the disorder, but even to interfere with the happiness of the family with whom she lived, had to attend on 7 persons, all of whom were in a very dangerous state, and one of whom died. Her attendance was assiduous and unremitted for nearly 3 weeks, yet she has never been in the slightest degree affected. At an early stage of the disorder, the elders of the African church met and offered their services to the mayor to procure nurses for the sick and to assist in the burying of the dead. Their offers were accepted, and Absalom Jones and Richard Allen undertook the former department, that of furnishing nurses, and William Gray, the latter, the internment of the dead. The great demand for nurses afforded an opportunity for imposition, which was eagerly seized by some of the vilest of the blacks. They extorted $2, $3, $4, and even $5 a night for attendance, which would have been well paid by a single dollar. Some of them were even detected in the houses of the sick. But I mean, it's wrong to cast a censure on the whole for this sort of conduct, as many people have done. The services of Jones, Allen, and Gray, and others of their color have been very great and demand public gratitude. When the yellow fever prevailed in South Carolina, the Negroes, according to that accurate observer, Dr. Lining, were wholly free from it. Quote, "There is something very singular in the constitution of the Negroes," says he, "which renders them not liable to this fever, or though many of them were as much exposed as the nurses to this infection. Yet I never knew one instance of this fever among them, though they are equally subject with the white people to the bilious fever." End quote. The same idea prevailed for a considerable time in Philadelphia, but it was erroneous. They did not escape the disorder. However, the number of them that were seized by it was not great. And as I am informed by an eminent doctor, quote, "It yielded to the power of medicine in them more easier than whites."
A narrative of the proceedings of the black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793.
And a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publication.
By Absalom Jones
and Richard Allen.
in consequence of a partial representation of the conduct of the people who were employed to nurture the sick in the late calamitous state of the city of Philadelphia, we are solicited by a number of those who feel themselves injured thereby, and by the advice of several respectable citizens, to step forward and declare facts as they really are.
Seeing that from our situation, on account of the charge we took upon us, we had it more fully and generally in our power to know and observe the conduct and behavior of those that were so employed.
Early in September, a solicitation appeared in the public papers to the people of color to come forward and assist the distressed, perishing, and neglected sick, with the kind of assurance that people of color were not liable to take the infection.
Upon which we and a few others met and consulted how to act on so truly alarming and melancholy an occasion.
After some conversation, we found a freedom to go forth, confiding in him who can preserve in the midst of a burning, fiery furnace sensible that it was our duty to do all the good we could to our suffering fellow mortals.
We set out to see where we could be useful. The first we visited was a man in Elmsley Alley who was dying, and his wife lay dead at the time in the house. There were none to assist but 2 poor, helpless children. We administered what relief we could and applied to the overseers of the poor to have the woman buried. We visited upwards of 20 families that day. There were scenes of woe indeed. The Lord was pleased to strengthen us and remove all fear from us, and disposed our hearts to be as useful as possible.
In order to better regulate our conduct, we called on the mayor next day to consult with him how to proceed so as to be most useful.
The first object he recommended was a strict attention to the sick and the procuring of nurses. This was attended to by Absalom Jones and William Gray. And in order that the distressed might know where to apply, the mayor advertised to the public that upon application to them, they would be supplied.
Soon after, the mortally increasing, the difficulty of getting a corpse taken away was such that few were willing to do it when offered great rewards. The black people were looked to. We then offered our services in the public papers by advertising that we would remove the dead and procure nurses.
Our services were the production of real sensibility. We sought not fee nor reward until the increase of the disorder rendered our labor so arduous that we were not adequate to the service we had assumed.
The mortality increasing rapidly obliged us to call in the assistance of 5 hired men and the awful discharge of interring the dead. They, with great reluctance, were prevailed upon to join us. It was very uncommon at this time to find anyone that would go near, much more handle a sick or dead person.
Mr. Carey, in page 106 of his 3rd edition, has observed that, quote, "For the honor of human nature, it ought to be recorded that some of the convicts in the jails, a part of the term of whose confinement had been remitted as a reward for their peaceable, orderly behavior, voluntarily offered themselves as nurses to attend the sick at Bush Hill, and have, in that capacity, conducted themselves with great fidelity and care," unquote.
Here it ought to be remarked, although Mr. Carey hath not done it, that 2/3 of the persons who rendered these essential services were people of color who, on the application of elders of the African church who met to consider what they could do for the help of the sick, were liberated on condition of their doing the duty of nurses at the hospital at Bush Hill, which they as voluntarily accepted to do, as they did faithfully discharge this severe and disagreeable duty. May the Lord reward them both temporally and spiritually.
When the sickness became general and several of the physicians died and most of the survivors were exhausted by sickness or fatigue, that good man, Dr. Rush, called us more immediately to attend upon the sick. Knowing we could both bleed, he told us we could increase our utility by attending to his instructions, and accordingly directed us where to procure medicine duly prepared, with proper directions how to administer them, and at what stages of the disorder to bleed.
And when we found ourselves incapable of judging what was proper to be done, to apply to him, and he would, if able, attend to them himself, or send Edward Fisher, his pupil, which he often did. And Mr. Fisher manifested his humanity by an affectionate attention for their relief.
This has been no small satisfaction to us, for we think that when a physician was not attainable, we have been the instruments in the hand of God for saving the lives of some hundreds of our suffering fellow mortals.
We feel ourselves sensibly aggrieved by the censorious epithets of many who did not render the least assistance in the time of necessity, yet are liberal of their censure of us for the prices paid for our services when no one knew how to make a proposal to anyone they wanted to assist them.
At first, we made no charge. but left it to those we served in removing their dead to give what they thought fit. We set no price until the reward was fixed by those we had served. After paying the people we had to assist, our compensation is much less than many will believe.
We do assure to the public that all the money we have received for burying and for coffins, which we ourselves purchased and procured, has not defrayed the expense of wages which we had to pay to those whom we employed to assist us.
And we repeat our assurance that this is the fact. And we add another, which will serve to better explain it. We have buried several hundreds of poor persons and strangers, for which service we have never received nor never asked any compensation.
We feel ourselves hurt most by a partial, censorious paragraph in Mr. Carey's second edition of his account of the sickness in Philadelphia, pages 76 and 77, where he asperses the blacks alone for having taken the advantage of the distressed situation of the people. That same extravagant prices were paid, we admit. But how came they to be demanded? The reason is plain.
It was with difficulty persons could be had to supply the wants of the sick as nurses. Applications became more and more numerous. The consequence was, when we procured them at $6 per week and called upon them to go where they were wanted, we found they were gone elsewhere. Here was a disappointment. Upon inquiring the cause, we found that they had been allured away by others who offered greater wages until they got from $2 to $4 per day. We had no restraint upon the people.
It was natural for people in low circumstances to accept a voluntary bounteous reward, especially under the loathsomeness of many of the sick, when nature shuddered at the thoughts of the infection and the talk assigned was aggravated by lunacy and being left much alone with them. Had Mr. Carey been solicited to such an undertaking for hire, query, what would he have demanded? But Mr. Carey, although chosen a member of that band of worthies who have so eminently distinguished themselves by their labors for the relief of the sick and the helpless, yet quickly after his election left them to struggle with their arduous and hazardous talk by leaving the city.
'Tis true, Mr. Carey was no hireling and had a right to flee, and upon his return to plead the cause of those who fled. Yet we think he was wrong in giving so partial and injurious an account of the black nurses. If they have taken advantage of the public distress, is it any more than he hath done of its desire for information?
We believe he has had more money by the sale of his scraps than a dozen of the greatest extortioners among the black nurses.
The prices paid did not escape the observation of that worthy and vigilant magistrate, Matthew Clarkson, mayor of the city and president of the committee.
He sent for us and requested we would use our influence to lessen the wages of the nurses. But on informing him of the cause, i.e., that the people overbidding one another, it was concluded unnecessary to attempt anything on that head. Therefore, it was left to the people concerned.
That there were some few black people guilty of plundering the distressed, we acknowledge. But in that they only are pointed out and made mention of, we esteem partial and injurious. We know as many whites who were guilty of it, but this is looked over while the blacks are held up to censure.
Is it a greater crime for a black to pilfer than for a white to privateer?
We wish not to offend, but when an unprovoked attempt is made to make us blacker than we are, it becomes less necessary to be overcautious on that account.
Therefore, we shall take the liberty to tell of the conduct of some of the whites. We know £6 was demanded by and paid to a white woman for putting a corpse into a coffin and $40 was demanded and paid to 4 white men for bringing it down the stairs.
Mr. and Mrs. Taylor both died one night. A white woman had the care of them. After they were dead, she called on Jacob Servos, Esquire, for her pay, demanding £6 for laying them out. Upon seeing a bundle with her, he suspected she had pilfered. On searching her, Mr. Taylor's buckles were found in her pocket with other things.
An elderly lady, Mrs. Maloney, was given into the care of a white woman. She died. We were called to remove the corpse. When we came, the woman was laying so drunk that she did not know what we were doing. But we know she had one of Miss Maloney's rings on her finger and another in her pocket.
Mr. Carey tells us Bush Hill exhibited as wretched a picture of human misery as ever existed. A profligate, abandoned set of nurses and attendants, hardly any of good character could at that time be procured, rioted on the provisions and comforts prepared for the sick, who, unless at the hours when the doctors attended, were left almost entirely destitute of every assistance.
The dying and the dead were indiscriminately mingled together. The odor and other evacuations of the sick were allowed to remain in the most offensive state imaginable. Not the smallest appearance of order or regularity existed. It was in fact a great human slaughterhouse where numerous victims were immolated at the altar of intemperance.
It is unpleasant to point out the bad and unfeeling conduct of any color. Yet the defense we have undertaken obliges us to remark that although, quote, hardly any of good character at that time could be procured, unquote, yet only 2 black women were at this time in the hospital, and they were retained and the others discharged, when it was reduced to order and good government.
The bad consequences many of our color apprehended from a partial relation of our conduct are that it will prejudice the minds of the people in general against us, because it is impossible that one individual can have knowledge of all. Therefore, at some future day, when some of the most virtuous that were upon most praiseworthy motives, induced to serve the sick, may fall into the service of a family that are strangers to him or her, and it is discovered that it is one of those stigmatized wretches, who may we suppose will be the consequence? It is not reasonable to think the person will be abhorred, despised, and perhaps dismissed from employment to their great disadvantage. Would not this be hard? And have we not, therefore, sufficient reason to seek for redress?
We can with certainty assure the public we have seen more humanity, more real sensibility from the poor blacks than from the poor whites. When many of the former, of their own accord, rendered services where extreme necessity called for it, the general part of the poor white people were so dismayed that instead of attempting to be useful, they in a manner hid themselves. A remarkable instance of this.
A poor afflicted dying man stood at his chamber window, praying and beseeching everyone that passed by to help him to a drink of water. A number of white people passed, and instead of being moved by the poor man's distress, they hurried as fast as they could out of the sound of his cries, until at length a gentleman, who seemed to be a foreigner, came up, and he could not pass by, but had not resolution enough to go into the house. He held $8 in his hand and offered it to several as a reward for giving the poor man a drink of water, but was refused by everyone until a poor black man came up. The gentleman offered the $8 to him if he would relieve the poor man with a little water. "Master," replied the good-natured fellow, "I will supply the gentleman with water, but surely I will not take your money for it." Nor could he be prevailed upon to accept his bounty. He went in, supplied the poor object with water, and rendered him every service he could.
A poor black man named Samson went constantly from house to house where distress was, and no assistance without fee or reward. He was smote with the disorder and died. After his death, his family were neglected by those he had served.
Sarah Bass, a poor black widow, gave all the assistance she could in several families for which she did not receive anything. And when anything was offered her, she left it to the option of those she served.
A woman of our color nursed Richard Mason and son. When they died, Richard's widow, considering the risk the poor woman had run, and from observing the fears that sometimes rested on her mind, expected she would have demanded something considerable. But upon asking what she demanded, her reply was $50 a day. Mrs. Mason intimated it was not sufficient for her attendance. She replied it was enough for what she had done and would take no more. Mrs. Mason's feelings were such that she settled an annuity of £6 a year on her for life. Her name is Mary Scott.
An elderly black woman nursed with great diligence and attention. When recovered, he asked what he must give her for her services. She replied, "A dinner, master, on a cold winter's day." And thus she went from place to place, rendering every service in her power without an eye to reward.
A young black woman was requested to attend one night upon a white man and his wife who were very ill. No other person could be had. Great wages were offered her. She replied, "I will not go for money. If I go for money, God will see it and maybe make me take the disorder and die. But if I go and take no money, he may spare my life." She went about 9 o'clock and found them both on the floor. She could procure no candle or other light, but stayed with them about 2 hours and then left. They both died that night. She was afterward very ill with the fever. Her life was spared.
Caesar Cranchell, a black man, offered his services to attend the sick and said, I will not take your money. I will not sell my life for money." It is said he died with the flux.
A black lad at the Widow Gilpin's was entrusted with his young master's keys. On his leaving the city and transacted his business with the greatest honesty and dispatch, having unloaded a vessel for him in the time and loaded it again.
A woman that nursed David Bacon, charged with exemplary moderation, and said she would not have any more.
It may be said in the vindication of the conduct of those who discovered ignorance or incapacity in nursing that it is in itself a considerable art derived from experience as well as the exercise of the finer feelings of humanity. This experience, 9/10 of those employed, it is probable were wholly strangers to.
We do not recollect such acts of humanity from the poor white people in all the round we have been engaged in. We could mention many other instances of the like nature, but we think it needless.
It is unpleasant for us to make these remarks, but justice to our color demands it.
Mr. Carey pays William Gray and us a compliment. He says our services and others of their color have been very great. By naming us, he leaves these others in the hazardous state of being classed with those who are called the, quote, vilest, unquote. The few that were discovered to merit public censure were brought to justice, which ought to have sufficed without being canvassed over in his trifle of a pamphlet, which causes us to be more particular and endeavor to recall the esteem of the public for our friends and the people of color as far as they may be found worthy. For we conceive and experience proves it that an ill name is easier given than taken away. We have many unprovoked enemies who begrudge us the liberty we enjoy and are glad to hear of any complaint against our color, be it just or unjust, in consequence of which we are more earnestly endeavoring in all our power to warn, rebuke, and exhort our African friends to keep a conscious void of offense towards God and man, and at the same time would not be backward to interfere when stigmas or oppression appear pointed at or attempted against them unjustly. And we are confident we shall stand justified in the fight of the candid and judicious for such conduit.
Mr. Carey's first, second, and third editions are gone forth into the world, and in all probability have been read by thousands that will never read his fourth. Consequently, any alteration he may hereafter make in the paragraph alluded to cannot have the desired effect or atone for the past. Therefore, we apprehend it necessary to publish our thoughts on this occasion. Had Mr. Carey said, a number of white and black wretches eagerly seized on the opportunity to extort from the distressed, and some few of both were detected in plundering the sick, it might extenuate in a great degree the having made mention of the blacks.
We can allure the public. There were as many whites as black people detected in the pilfering, although the number of the latter employed as nurses was 20 times as great as the former, and that there is, in our opinion, as great a proportion of white as of black inclined to such practices.
It is rather to be admired that so many instances of pilfering and robbery happened, considering the great opportunities there were for such things. We do not know of more than 5 black people suspected of anything clandestine out of the great number employed. The people were glad to get any person to assist them. A black was preferred because it was supposed they were not so likely to take the disorder. The most worthless were acceptable, so that it would have been no cause of wonder if 20 causes of complaint occurred for one that hath.
It has been alleged that many of the sick were neglected by the nurses. We do not wonder at it, considering their situation in many instances up night and day without anyone to relieve them, worn down with fatigue and want of sleep. They could not, in many cases, render the assistance which was needful. Where we visited, the causes of complaint on this score were not numerous.
The case of the nurses in many instances were deserving of commiseration. The patient raging and frightful to behold. It has frequently required 2 persons to hold them from running away. Others have made attempts to jump out of a window. In many chambers, they were nailed down and the door was kept locked to prevent them from running away or breaking their necks. Others lay vomiting blood and screaming enough to chill them with horror. Thus were many of the nurses circumstanced, alone, until the patient died, then called away to another scene of distress, and thus have been for a week or 10 days left to do the best they could without any sufficient rest. Many of them having some of their dearest connections sick at the time and suffering for want, while their husband, wife, father, mother, and other family members have been engaged in the service of the white people.
We mentioned this to shew the difference between this and nursing in common cases. We have suffered equally with the whites. Our distress hath been very great, but much unknown to white people. Few have been the whites that paid attention to us while the black were engaged in the other's service. We can assure you, the public, we have taken 4 and 5 black people in a day to be buried. In several instances, when they have been seized with the sickness while nursing, They have been turned out of the house and wandering and destitute until taking shelter wherever they could, as many of them would not be admitted to their former homes. They have languished alone, and we know of one who even died in a stable.
Others acted with more tenderness when their nurses were taken sick. They had proper care taken of them at their houses. We know of 2 instances of this.
It is even to this day a generally received opinion in the city that our color was not so liable to the sickness as the whites. We hope our friends will pardon us for setting this matter in its true state.
The public were informed that in the West Indies and other places where this terrible malady had been, it was observed that blacks were not affected with it. Happy would it have been for you, and much more so for us, if this observation had been verified by our experience.
When the people of color had the sickness and died, we were imposed upon and told it was not with the prevailing sickness until it became too notorious to be denied. Then we were told some few died, but not many.
Thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives, yet you accuse us of extorting a little money for you.
The Bill of Mortality for the year 1793, published by Matthew Whitehead and John Ormrod, clerks, and Joseph Dolby, sexton, will convince any reasonable person that will examine it that as many colored people died in proportion as others. In 1792, there were 67 of our colored buried. And in 1793, it amounted to 305. Thus, the burials among us have increased more than 4-fold. Was not this a great degree the effects of the services of the unjustly vilified black people?
Perhaps it may be acceptable to the reader to know how we found the sick affected by the sickness. Our opportunities of hearing and seeing them have been very great. They were taken with a chill, a headache, a sick stomach, with pains in the limbs and back. This was the way the sickness in general began. But all were not affected alike. Some appeared but slightly affected with some of these symptoms. What confirmed us in the opinion of a person being smitten was the color of their eyes.
In some, it raged more furiously than others. Some have languished for 7 and 10 days and appeared to get better the day or some hours before they died, while others were cut off in 1, 2, or 3 days, but their complaints were familiar. Some lost their reason and raged with all the fury madness could produce and died in strong convulsions.
Others retained their reason to the last and seemed rather to fall asleep than die. We could not help remarking that the former were of strong passions and the latter of a mild temper.
Numbers died in a kind of dejection. They concluded that they must go, so the phrase for dying was, and therefore in a kind of fixed, determined state of mind, went off.
It struck our minds with awe to have application made by those in health to take charge of them in their sickness and of their funeral. Such applications, how he would have it conducted. It seemed a surprising circumstance, for the man appeared at the time to be in perfect health, but calling 2 or 3 days after to see him, found a woman dead in the house, and the man so far gone that to administer anything for his recovery was needless. He died that evening. We mention this as an instance of the dejection and despondence that took hold on the minds of thousands, and are of opinion it aggravated the case of many, while others who bore up cheerfully got up again that probably would otherwise have died.
When the mortality came to its greatest stage, it was impossible to procure sufficient assistance. Therefore, many whose friends and relations had left them died unseen and unassisted. We have found them in various situations. some laying on the floor, as bloody as if they had been dipped in it, without any appearance of their having had even a drink of water for their relief. Others laying on a bed with their clothes on, as if they had come in fatigued and lain down to rest. Some appeared as if they had fallen dead on the floor from the position we found them in.
Truly, our talk was hard. Yet through mercy, we were enabled to go on. One thing we observed in several instances, when we were called on the first appearance of the disorder to bleed, the person frequently on the opening a vein before the operation was near over, felt a change for the better and expressed a relief in their chief complaints. And we made it a practice to take more blood from them than is usual in other cases. These, in a general way, recovered. Those who did omit bleeding any considerable time, after being taken by the sickness, rarely expressed any change they felt in the operation.
We feel a great satisfaction in believing that we have been useful to the sick, and thus publicly thank Dr. Rush for enabling us to be so. We have bled upwards of 800 people and do declare we have not received to the value of $1.50, therefore. We were willing to imitate the doctor's benevolence, who, sick or well, kept his house open day and night to give what assistance he could in this time of trouble.
Several affecting instances occurred when we were engaged in burying the dead. We have been called to bury some who, when we came, we found alive. At other places, we found a parent dead, and none but little innocent babes to be seen, whose ignorance led them to think their parent was asleep. On account of their situation and their little prattle, we have been so wounded and our feelings so hurt that we almost concluded to withdraw from our undertaking. But seeing others so backward, we still went on.
An affecting instance. A woman died, and we were sent for to bury her, and on our going into the house and taking the coffin in, a dear little innocent accosted us. "Mama is asleep, don't wake her." But when she saw us put her in the coffin, the distress of the child was so great that it almost overcame us. When she demanded why we put her mama in the box, we did not know how to answer her, but committed her to the care of a neighbor and left her with heavy hearts.
In other places where we have been to take the corpse of a parent and have found a group of little ones alone, some of them in a measure capable of knowing their situation, their cries and the innocent confusion of the little ones seemed almost too much for human nature to bear. We have picked up little children that were wandering, they knew not where, whose parents were cut off, and taken them to the orphan house. For at this time, the dread that prevailed over people's minds was so general that it was a rare instance to see one neighbor visit another. And even friends, when they met in the streets, were afraid of each other. Much less would they admit into their houses the distressed orphan that had been where the sickness was. This extreme seemed in some instances to have the appearance of barbarity.
With reluctance, we called to mind the many opportunities there were in the power of individuals to be useful to their fellow men, yet through the terror of the times was omitted. A black man riding through the street saw a man push a woman out of the house. The woman staggered and fell on her face in the gutter and was not able to turn herself. The black man thought she was drunk, but observing she was in danger of suffocation, alighted, and taking the woman up, found her perfectly sober, but so far gone with the disorder that she was not able to help herself. The hard-hearted man threw her down, shut the door, and left her in such a situation, she might have perished in a few minutes.
We heard of it and took her to Bush Hill.
Many of the white people that ought to be patterns for us to follow after have acted in a manner that would make humanity shudder. We remember an instance of cruelty which we trust no black man would be guilty of. Two sisters, orderly, decent, white women, were sick with the fever. One of them recovered so as to come to the door. A neighboring white man saw her and in an angry tone asked her if her fever was dead or not. She answered no, upon which he replied, "Damn her. If she don't die before morning, I will make her die."
The poor woman, shocked at such an expression from this monster of a man, made a modest reply, upon which he snatched a tub of water and would have dashed it over her if it had not been prevented by a black man. He then went and took a couple of fowls out of a coop which had been given them for nourishment and threw them into an open alley. He had his wish. The poor woman that he would make die died that night. A white man threatened to shoot us if we passed by his house with a corpse. We buried him 3 days later.
We have been pained to see the widows come to us, crying and wringing their hands, and in a very great distress on account of their husband's death, having nobody to help them. They were obliged to come to get their husbands buried. Their neighbors were afraid to go to their help or to condole with them. We ascribe such unfriendly conduct to the frailty of human nature and not to the willful unkindness or hardness of heart.
Notwithstanding the compliment Mr. Carey has paid us, we have found reports spread of our taking between 100 and 200 beds from houses where people died. Such slanderers as these, who propagate such willful lies, are dangerous, although unworthy of notice. We wish if any person hath the least suspicion of us, they would endeavor to bring us to the punishment which such atrocious conduct must deserve, and by this means the innocent will be cleared from reproach and the guilty known.
We shall now conclude with the following old proverb, which we think applicable to those of our color who exposed their lives in the late afflicting dispensation.
God and soldier, all men do adore, in time of war and not before.
When the war is over and all things righted, God is forgotten and the soldier slighted.
Address of Matthew Carey to the public, Philadelphia, April 4th, 1794. Since I have taken up the pen, it may not be amiss to offer a few observations respecting a publication ushered into the world by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two free Africans, in which abuse is very liberally bestowed upon me. At the time of its appearance, I judged it undeserving of notice and was determined in silence to let the public decide on the justice of their appeal. From this determination, I should not have departed had I not engaged in the present to reply to Argus and thought it might be advisable to touch on their attack. The paragraph which has called forth the indignation of Jones and Allen and afforded them an excuse for no small portion of very indecent, unjust, and ungrateful reflections on me, is the following, quote, "The great demand for nurses afforded an opportunity for imposition, which was eagerly seized by some of the vilest of the blacks. They extorted $2, $3, $4, and even $5 a night for attendance, which would have been well paid by a single dollar. Some of them were even detected in plundering the houses of the sick. But it is unjust to cast a censure on the whole for this sort of conduct, as many people have done. The services of Jones, Allen, and Gray, and others of their color have been very great and demand public gratitude. End quote. I would fain ask the reader, is this the language of an enemy? Is it not rather that of an advocate endeavoring to palliate facts which are not attempted to be denied? Does this deserve railing or reproach? Is it honorable for Jones and Allen to repay evil for good? A short account of the malignant fever lately prevalent in Philadelphia with a statement of the proceedings that took place on the subject in different parts of the United States by Matthew Carey. Final edition, 1830. When the yellow fever prevailed in South Carolina, the Negroes, according to that accurate observer, Dr. Lining, were wholly free from it. Quote, "There is something very singular in the constitution of the Negroes," says he, "which renders them not liable to this fever. For though many of them were as much exposed as the nurses to this infection, yet I have never known one instance of this fever among them, though they are equally subject with the white people to the bilious fever." End quote. The same idea prevailed for a considerable time in Philadelphia, but it was erroneous. They did not escape the disorder. However, there were scarcely any of them seized at first, and the number that were finally affected was not great, and it is asserted by an eminent doctor, quote, "It yielded to the power of medicine in them more easily than in the whites." End quote. The error that prevailed on this subject had a salutary effect, for at an early period of the disorder, few white nurses could be procured, and had the Negroes been equally terrified, the sufferings of the sick, great as they actually were, would have been exceedingly aggravated. At the period alluded to, the elders of the African church met and offered their assistance to the mayor to procure nurses for the sick and aid in the burying of the dead. Their offers were accepted, and Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and William Gray undertook the management of these services. The great demand for nurses afforded an opportunity for imposition, which was eagerly seized by some of those who acted in that capacity, both colored and white. They extorted $2, $3, $4, and even $5 a night for such attendance as would have been well paid for by a single dollar. Some of them were even detected in plundering the houses of the sick. On examining the books of the hospital at Bush Hill, it appears that there were nearly 20 colored people received there, of whom about 3/4 died.
That's the end of our dramatic presentation for this evening. Thank you for staying with us and for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Brían. So I'm going to invite our actors to come take their place down in the audience and ask our panelists to come up and take their place here where the actors were on stage. And as our panelists are coming up, and you can come right up now, we're going to pull these chairs on stage. We have a fleeting amount of time together left on this cold Friday evening. here at Ebenezer United Methodist Church. So I want to plant the first seed of the first question I'm going to ask you as an audience, both here in the church and also on Zoom. And while our panelists and our actors are finding their seats, I'd love for you to think about this. And then as soon as our panelists are done, I'm going to come right out to you with microphones and we're going to ask you questions. So here's the question we'd love you to think about. These 5 texts you heard were written in 1793. And I don't, I can't imagine any of the authors imagined that we'd be reading them now. It's been attributed to Mark Twain, although unclear whether he ever said it, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. As you listen to these texts from 1793 here tonight, or wherever you are in the world, what resonated with you, what touched you, what spoke to you, and what rhymed? I'm going to come back to that question in a few seconds. Before we do, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists. Are we missing a panelist? I guess we have, oh, you guys are going to be panelists too. We had you coming up on stage as well. We have chairs. We will get you one more chair. Come on up. There's one right here, I promise. I'm an all-service facilitator. I move chairs. We'll scooch in. There's no way that I'm going to deny the DC Fire Department a place in this conversation on the stage. Okay, now that we've sorted that out, thank you so much. Be careful up there. So I'm going to turn things over to our panelists, and as I mentioned to our panelists before, whoever's making the best eye contact gets to go first, and they're all looking down now.
I'll go first.
Okay, they volunteered themselves. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, and we're going to have to share the mic, so just grab a mic
That's fine.
and launch directly into your gut response. What spoke to you, what resonated, what rhymed?
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Black. I am a retired Air Force chaplain. Also, I pastor one of the greatest churches in the greater Washington, D.C. area, Lincoln Park United Methodist Church. What struck me this evening was I am glad that I questioned Dr. Rush's letter to Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. I said, how can he ask those 2 preachers to take on such a great responsibility? But as they kept reading through, I understood what was going on. And to Richard Allen and to Absalom Jones, they took on a very hardship ministry, I would say. And for them to take that ministry on and that orchestrate the yellow fever was very difficult. And I was sitting there, I wonder, me as a preacher, would I be able to do that back then in 1793? And so for you guys to not only take it on and orchestrate the ministry and the medicine to those 55,000 people in Philadelphia, and also ask 2,000 of your own people to help with the ministry of taking care of the sick. And then for, I think with Mr. Carey, he ran away.
He's here.
Oh, yeah. It seemed like Mr. Carey just dumped it off on you guys to make that city not accept you guys. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being first. Thank you for being brief. Ben, would you like to go? Katie, would you like to go? Somebody else would like to go? Pick Ben, go right ahead. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Benjamin Quintanilla. I'm a nurse and a paramedic also, and I think what resonated with me during the reading was a lot of what the people were doing this without payment, and that holds true for me also. Obviously, having come through COVID and all that, and payment wasn't the main reason. It was, and you could tell through the reading all the care that they wanted to do for the patients and for the people. It's just to give them a drink of water, just to be there for the people. And yes, they were being outbidded by others, which, again, history repeats itself. That's how it was. But we weren't doing it for the money. We knew the risks that we were exposing ourselves to. but the people meant the most to us, and that's why we did what we did as nurses. So history does repeat itself.
Thank you so much, Ben, for going and for bringing COVID into the room and bringing the story of COVID into the room. The pandemic really challenged the field of nursing. We did a project with nurses called the Nurse Antigone during this time. One of my colleagues, Cinda Rushton, is here, who's a nurse from Johns Hopkins University, to give nurses a place to process what they were going through. And what we heard from nurses, like you brought into the room, was how it divided the profession of nursing against itself, that there were people who would become private nurses and would get more money, but they were also up against incredibly high-stakes situations. And the social contract began to fray, not just in our society, but in hospitals and in clinics and in places of care. And nurses were at the forefront of seeing that, and of course they were touched by that. So I appreciate you bringing it into the room. I don't want to be long-winded, but we have a nurse next in line. But so Katie, would you mind taking the mic, and over to you?
Sure. Good evening. I'm so honored to be here. And again, I'd like to commend the actors for bringing this story to life. I'm the Senior VP of Equity and Engagement at the American Nurses Association. I've been a nurse for about 30 years, so, I honor my fellow nurse at the end of the table here. But I think I have mixed feelings listening to this story because you tend to not hear about the plight of nurses in some of these stories. And you definitely don't hear about the plight of Black nurses in a lot of historical contexts. And we know that to a certain degree, or to a large degree, the profession itself was born in slavery. There was a time when African slaves were called wet nurses. And they were called that when they would have babies. A number of you are nodding, have babies, and they don't get to raise their own children. Their babies are ripped from their arms and sold into slavery, and they were forced to breastfeed the babies of their masters. And then you have the midwives and a lot of the talents that were robbed and taken from Africa, where a number of those slaves and Africans that came over moved and transferred those skills to heal their masters that were also killing them and harming them. So this story also akin to the story of the discovery of the cure for TB in Seaview, New York, where a lot of patients were deserted, families deserted patients, and the Black nurses in Long Island in New York stayed, and in that they helped find the cure for TB. It's a story that's not very well told, but it's called The Black Angels, and I encourage you to look into it. And as a matter of fact, one of the nurses that lived during that time, her name is Virginia Allen, and she's still alive today, and we're hosting her in DC at the Press Club for an equity summit that we're having to talk about a lot of the issues that are happening today. But make no mistake, the dehumanization and devaluation of Black life continues today in a number of respects. We know that there's still a feeling that Black people don't feel pain as much as their white counterparts. We see it in sickle cell patients. We see it also in kidney failure patients in a number of different respects. And in terms of practice, Black nurses tend to be given the harder assignments, the sicker patients. So a lot of this still exists today in practice. It still exists today in the profession, and that's why we decided to form the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing, because we had to identify the fact that becoming a nurse doesn't make you a saint. We have people, the nurses that come from the general population, so of course we have nurses that are still harming patients, harming some of their counterparts, and that's why we want to address it, because we do feel that it doesn't make sense that in 2025, only 10% of the nursing population is Black. And we know that it's not because of a lack of desire for people that want to enter into the profession.
Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate it. Would you like to go next?
I guess we're going in order.
We might as well. Just
Might as well. I am John C. Cogman, and I am a district superintendent in the United Methodist Church, covering the churches in Washington, D.C., as well as 4 counties in Maryland. This evening gave me an emotional roller coaster ride. I sat there as a Black, as a woman, as a clergy, as a mother, as a wife. So a lot of the things resonated with me. My emotions went from, I can't believe that. How dare he? Really? Anger, sympathy, empathy, and just really becoming numb. And thinking of what happened back then is still happening today. It's just not called yellow fever. Thanks.
thank you so much. Thank you. Xavier.
Hi, I'm Xavier Hodge. I'm with Capitol Hill United Methodist Church. I'm a grad student at Howard University School of Divinity. And my gut reaction, I think when you guys ended, I had way more questions than I thought that I would have. It's amazing how history mirrors the present time. And I was thinking that Jones and Allen were somewhat of Fauci 200 years ago, you know? And it was amazing to me that it seems like in every kind of calamity or situation, pandemic, whatever it is, there's always a reason for somebody to find someone to blame. And that was it just hit me like a brick. I'm like, this just happened a couple of years ago. This is the same thing. And you guys acted it out so well that I wanted to stop you and ask questions. It was that good. But it also reinforced how propaganda, how lies, how the twisting of the truth, or just the simple changing of one word. You know, instead of, on this end, they were asked to do it. On that end, they volunteered. You know, which one was it? That simple twist of a word changes the whole context. And it has a population believing one thing about a group of people, when even in the letter, even in the rebuttal, even in the initial letter, when he pointed out that there were Black people, had he just said there were some vile people who were pillaging, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Just that addition of that one word, you know, so significant. And I'm just wondering, how do we stop this cycle of coming apart because of lies? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xavier.
Good evening. Ooh. My name is Keisa Hill, and I'm a paramedic with DC Fire. This evening, I would like to piggyback along with some of the other platform members. With Mr. Jones and Mr. Allen's role, I do see that it's a lot of what we go through on a daily basis, and with them volunteering their services, willing to go in and help with no questions asked, and not necessarily being compensated on our end, but just being in a thankless position, and everyone is just expecting you to be there and to do just because, without any actions on how you're gonna feel, the outcome of your mindset, or your mental state afterwards. They just expect for you to be there. And the yellow fever also, just like Ben stated, was very similar to me as far as the pandemic. So that was kind of familiar to me as well. But that's all I have at the moment.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Letitia Clark, firefighter paramedic, DC Fire for 21 years. What I got from the story is how history repeats itself, just like most of everyone on the panel stated. Selfless acts, going into the unknown, and even getting sick from going into the unknown. and having to deal with those long-term effects of not knowing what you're going into just to help and being compensated and not being compensated as well, working tirelessly just to get the job done. But like I said, history repeating itself and just being selfless and helping others.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank all 7 of our panelists for getting us started with a quick round of applause. It's no small thing to get up after a reading like this and make personal connections in the moment. So I thank you for your candor, for showing us the way forward, for getting us started. As I mentioned before, I'm going to turn my back to you, but not out of disrespect, because we're going to try to move the energy around out here. But you have live mics, so like the voice of God, you can come back into the conversation whenever you feel so moved. And I hope you will come back into the conversation, because I know you have a lot of other things to bring into it and to help us facilitate the conversation we need to have. But thank you for what you brought into the room. We were struggling during rehearsal with that question that I think several of you answered in many ways. Like, just that one word, vile. Is that, maybe if that just wasn't included, and we'd be talking about something entirely different. So, or black, and why was it included? And this notion that you brought up of scapegoats. And why do we always need them? And why do we always replicate that ritual of dumping all of our pollution onto an innocent and then sacrificing the innocent? That ritual of scapegoating. Why is that part of our culture here? Why is it human behavior to do that? And why does it keep happening? There's so many things we can talk about, but I appreciate all the perspectives that brought into the room. But I'm just going to repeat the question for you in the room and for you on Zoom watching all over the world. And Brían, who played Matthew Carey, is going to be my mic runner tonight because I know he's fast. There's nothing worse than a slow mic runner. And Brían knows to move quickly and decisively when he sees a hand come up. But in spite of the distance of time, it feels very pointed to be standing here in this historic church thinking about time like that, thinking about 1793, not so long before the founding of this church here, which also housed the first school for African-American children in D.C. In spite of the distance of time, what spoke to you in the reading? It was a long reading, but I was rapt. I hope you were too. It was the first time we're hearing it out loud, both by the skill of the actors, but also by the skill of the writers, and in particular, Jones and Allen. The tightrope act of walking that fine line of expressing themselves without giving people cause to vilify or cast aspersion at them, being emotional and demonstrating a humanity that was intrinsic to who they were without performing it. Like all those things were in the performance tonight. So what resonated with you? There's always, there's a couple hands here. Your hand was first, so I'll come to you, sir, and I see your hand right there, and we'll move the energy around.
Hey, so that was great, first of all. So I grew up in Philadelphia, fighting a racist police commissioner who became the mayor for 8 years in the 1970s. And eventually we beat Frank Rizzo. So the racism of 150 years earlier struck me. I would say that, two big contradictions. One, the total lie about the biology, if anything, was understated. So the risk seemed to me, it didn't feel strong enough given the lie that it was. And going back even in 1830 and repeating it. And secondly, the greed of Carey is understated, I think. I think, as I know it, several 100,000 of those pamphlets were sold. And then you have the amazing example of Allen and Jones. And I'll just end by saying the positive note would be, for me growing up then, Allen and Jones lived on and Carey did not.
Appreciate all that. Thank you. I'll come to you 1 second, sir. I just want to say for those of you watching online, all you have to do is raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll promote some of you to the screen, and you'll join us here it never gets old for us, but I just want to encourage you out there and just acknowledge, it's actually 10,000 copies, 4 print runs, but at the time the population was 55,000, so 10,000 is quite a few copies of that pamphlet. And then Jones and Allen's first federally copyrighted work by African Americans, somewhere between 250 and 400 copies. So, it's an important thing to bring into the room. And who's profiting off the story? Who's writing the story? Who gets to tell the story? I really appreciate you bringing that into the room in Philadelphia as well. Thanks for your patience, sir.
Hi. The thing that stood out to me was the tremendous compassion that the blacks had for the whites who were sick, and some of the whites could care less, And then you had the guy, I can't remember his name, on the stage. Carey. The second one there. How he tried to minimize the truth of the matter. And the thing that stands out, that kind of reflect today, we see the same thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I see your hand back there. We're going to go over there, and I'll come back over there in a second. Yeah, please, yeah.
Hello. I think I kept going back to the statement from Carey around, in terms of what should be offered around $1. And so, as a Black woman in this current time, I just reflect on my labor and what it means to be human. And so the questions that I'm wrestling with, is my humanity only based upon my utility and labor? Can you acknowledge my being beyond this, or in this history of this nation, with the lingering lesions of plantation economics, is my worthiness only based on my income bracket? And that's what I took away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love those questions. I'm going to incorporate them into the facilitation somehow as we move this project forward. That's what I meant by the audience always knows more. The audience is the facilitator when you trust the wisdom that's in every audience. I really appreciate what you bring into the room of the transactional nature of healthcare that's being discussed, and then how that tracks to worth in our society, and in particular from your perspective as a Black woman, as you bring into the room, like, what is my worth? How dangerous it is to talk about our worth in transactional terms, and yet how transactional we've become. Not just our healthcare, but every aspect of our society and our life. So, and it feels very pointed to be saying that, now. Thank you for bringing that into the room, for everything you said. There's a hand that was back here. Oh, there's a mic coming to you right there. Thank you.
So there were a couple of themes, I think, that kind of resonate. One of which is the specificity of vocabulary by all that published, and the use of very specific words to get a point across, I think carries a lot of weight, including today. The other thing in regards to the writing is the power of omission, and so of truth not told a lot of times will resonate across all of the publications. And so by leaving out certain facts, certain ideas, certain ideals, you can hide a lot of things that you don't want people to see. And then the last thing, I think, was there are certain levels of humanity that we are called to service, be it on a humanitarian level, on a charitable level, on a clergy level, and that can be exploited and has been exploited throughout time. And I think that is something that you see in Benjamin Rush's letter, is calling upon the clergy to then unknowingly or unwittingly exploit a population to call to service without pay, without reward, to then become part of this thing, this machine of medicine and the exploitation that we see. And we continue to see that across the world, not just in this country, but across the world, where we lean into this idea of being a better human will allow for you to get to where you're trying to go to feel better about that. And at the same time, it's just being exploited.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we wrestled with some of the questions I think you're bringing into the room. Like, Benjamin Rush was an abolitionist. From what I understand, he legitimately believed, or he sincerely believed, that race relations in Philadelphia would be improved if the black community served in this role for the white community, believing that they would be immune to the yellow fever. And yet, it's hard while watching it on stage not to read it as coercive. And I think that tension is something we can just let float and sit with the complexity of that. Because sometimes we're being coercive and we don't even know it, and that doesn't absolve us of responsibility. And sometimes we're taking advantage of people's good nature, and we're not aware of it as well. So, I mean, there's probably more complexity to be brought. Yeah, Katie, if you want to help me out, I appreciate it.
I think that's the key thing today is that we need to take responsibility more for the outcome and less for our intent.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a lot of that out there, but I didn't mean to say that. I didn't, this is not about the defensive posture of, I'm not racist. It's really about how you need to be an anti-racist to really challenge the status quo, because I love this quote by Martin Luther King about how we need to create a network of maladjusted people, which means that you're not accepting the status quo. You are doing what you need to do to push against what is going to be normalized. Just the other day, I was at the Riggs Hotel at a panel that was hosted by U.S. News and World Report, and on the panel was someone from the Heritage Foundation. My head is on fire, and everyone's acting like this is normal. This is not okay, but this is how it's happening. Like, we're normalizing having these folks in our spaces. And to your point about the story being the omission piece, I have an African proverb for you that addresses that, and it says, "Until the lion tells a story, the hunter will always be the hero." This is intentional in some cases, the way these stories are being told. And we need to acknowledge that too.
Thank you so much. And who the narrator is essential, I think, to the conversation we're having tonight. Who gets to tell the story? I appreciate what you brought up in the room about omission. We also wrestled with that during rehearsal. Like, what made Jones and Allen write this? What fired them up? Was it the vilest of the blacks that was said? Or was it the omission of the deaths of the people who, in their company, from their community, who died at Bush Hill Hospital, or a combination of all these things? Yeah.
I believe Absalom Jones and Richard Allen wanted to get it right for history, for us today.
Yeah.
They wanted to get the details. That's why I liked about it. It was so much detail. And as an Air Force Hospital chaplain, it's about details. And those two pastors gave a lot of detail, descriptive.
Yeah.
So there's no way in the world you can not say it didn't happen, because it did happen.
Yeah. Yeah, the lived experience. And the irony of someone who wasn't there writing the history versus those who were on the ground. And that's why it was important for us we didn't cut the text. That was because we needed to hear every detail. Ben, you were going to say something.
Yeah,
and also Heather, I believe, is waiting on Zoom, so we're going to go up there in just a sec.
Yep. Yeah. Another thing that was very clear was the separation of the classes. Not only was there racism, but there was an absolute separation of the classes when they talked about the servants and the poor and how they were abandoned by all this and they were left to fend for themselves. So that was very clear in the writing. And that was just moving, and unfortunately that still occurs very much so today. The separation of the classes and the racism is very well and alive still.
Thank you so much, Ben. Heather, you've been waiting for some time on Zoom. Would you mind unmuting yourself? What resonated with you? What touched you? What rhymed? What spoke to you tonight?
First, I want to say thank you very much to the actors. Incredibly moving, beautiful performances. I have been watching Theater of War since Nurse Antigone during the pandemic, and it was a great support to me as a nurse. I've been a nurse for several decades, and all I can add to this is that this trajectory from yellow fever to COVID is very essential right now, because we're going into an era where we may not have protections that we had in the past. If we do not have a proper NIH or CDC or overall global connection to health that we've had in the past, things like bird flu may creep up on us. And so I say to you all, stay healthy. And also think of the lessons from the past. Nurses are not perfect. I think we have to shift that paradigm a little bit. We have to think about how we've created the structure of nursing. At one point, it was a caregiver position, and then it became a profession, and then to a certain extent, mercenary. So we just have to be very wary of that as we approach the future and the uncertainty of what pandemics might lie before us. Thank you.
Boy, thank you, Heather, very much. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're wrong. I really hope that we're not going to have history rhyme again anytime within our lifetimes with regard to a pandemic or an epidemic. Yeah. But it does feel very pointed to be having this. We were discussing even with the foundation and with our partners, is it too soon to be having this conversation about COVID? Or maybe to Heather's point, is it too late to be having the conversation about the future? It felt right on time to me listening to the performance tonight. For those of you who know Theater of War Productions, you know that we just launched a radio show, and so we're also very comfortable being audio only. And I believe Sue is on right now, but audio only. Sue, if you can hear us, what resonated with you? What spoke to you tonight? What touched you? Well, maybe Sue isn't going to be with us, but maybe she'll just appear like the voice.
I am.
Yeah, over there. Oh, you are.
Here I am.
Sue, please.
I, in many ways, see the very similar things to what many people have said, but I just want to express my view about the difference in humanity as expressed by Allen and Jones in terms of the people who are Black and the contributions that they were making at the time, and that of Carey, who, in my view, represented the white, rich folks then and today. And this view that, oh, these whatever, not quite human, but these folks, whatever they are, they're not gonna get the same illnesses or have the same reactions to yellow fever, and how that kept being repeated the whole time, even when it was clear that that was not the case, which in my opinion should have been clear in general at the beginning. And little things that were said that I keep hearing said today. I can't read my own writing, lovely, but the tender and humane masters, really. This question of blame and who is, quote, pilfering, and how so much today is the same in terms of blaming people. That's the basis for so much of what's going on today, in my opinion, as well. We'll just blame those folks over there, those, quote, illegals, those lazy people, those this, those that, to keep us divided in ways that we need to really be united. And I also was thinking about the pandemic, and I heard many of the same things that Carey was saying. I literally heard them, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Who got access to vaccines initially was not an accident. It was very divided. And I'm a teacher. In my state, teachers were not considered frontline workers. We did not have any kind of special access to the vaccines at first. And many teachers died, as did healthcare workers, well, as did a lot of people. But to me, that mirrors the way teachers are being related to now. And this question of the way these systems are being dismantled, obviously, there's bureaucracy, or in my view, there's bureaucracy. But just to dismantle all the systems that are can possibly help people in a systematic sense are being thrown away. It's like then, it's not a good time now.
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate you joining us over Zoom. We have one more coming in Zoom in just a second, but we're going to go over here first. So hold on, Joseph. It's really good to see you. I know you. I want to acknowledge something I think Sue brought into the room, and others have also. Like there's a myth at the center of Carey's story, but it's at the center also of Dr. Rush's letter and the center of Dr. Lining's assessment, that there's a medical difference between races. And it's still being propagated. That there's a physical, so there are such things as immunity we build up, obviously, from our exposure to different diseases, but and all kinds of things that happen to populations that share certain conditions, living conditions, social conditions. But the myth at the center of those three stories, those three ideas, is that there's a biological difference between races. And if we believe race is a social construct, there can't be a biological difference. I know this is 101 for most people, but I just want to state it out loud because we're still hearing the same thing said now that was said in 1793. There was a hand over here who has a mic, and I'll come to you in just one second.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for sharing and telling this story. I'm somewhat familiar with the figure of Carey, more familiar with Richard Allen, but being familiar with Carey, I knew that he was a publisher and a Bible publisher, so I just kept wondering, even coming to this event and then hearing more of the talk, like, why is he speaking to this? Why is he speaking to a health crisis? Why is he writing this? And that, just your point, Miss Katie, about what is the outcome versus your intent. So I was very curious about his intent, but seeing the outcome is just, it definitely leaves with more questions, but just asking why. Why do we continue to listen to certain people who haven't earned the right to speak to these situations? So that's always on my mind. And then I just was so struck by the courage of the people in the community in Philadelphia, especially because I'm sure they knew that they were not immune to this fever. And this was not the first lie that was told to them. And so, just the courage of claiming their humanity through the kindness, through the acts of kindness, and for Absalom Jones and for Richard Allen to be writing this powerful, evidence, beautiful, and confident refutation, which I love the title of this play because that's what it's about. It's the refutation. It's not the accusation. It's the refutation that holds the last word. And them writing that, knowing it would probably only reach those 200, 400, compared to thousands and thousands, that in history is speaking to us today.
Thank you so much. It's a perfect segue to my second question, and I'm going to ask a few questions. You can ignore them. You can ask your own questions. You can just sum everything up into one beautiful, perfect statement. I don't really care. I just want to use the time we have wisely in this fleeting time together. But this question of outcomes, because I appreciate what Katie brought into the room, like intent versus, it is curious why Carey would write this if he wasn't there, right? Pamphlets were almost the form of social media of the late 1700s. It was a sort of quick, dirty way of publishing and getting your ideas out into the world. So it was fascinating to hear the two up against these two pamphlets performed for me up against each other. One of the outcomes I wonder about is about, so at the center of it is who writes history and who has the authority to tell the story, and then what's at stake. And finally, and this is the thing I was thinking about when you were speaking, what would we think if Jones and Allen hadn't written their Refutation? You can ignore that question. Someone else, but I'm going to let it float. Someone will take it on. Let's go there, and then I'll come right over here in one sec. Yeah. And Joseph, I haven't forgotten about you on screen. Yeah.
Hi. I want to shout out my granddaddy and my aunt for inviting me here today. I walked in here very blind. I didn't know what the conversation was going to be, but I'm really glad that I came. I know we've been relating the yellow fever to COVID, but I don't want us to forget that these systems also affect things like diseases like HIV, maternal mortality, and other chronic conditions across the Black community. And, due to the very real impacts of our new administration, HIV prevention in Africa has completely stopped. So I just want us to remember that it's not just about, these crazy pandemics, but this conversation made me meditate this week on, it was just very profoundly synchronous to what was happening to me this week, because I was actually diagnosed with a chronic disease this week, and I've had a range of emotions to process it. This conversation has taken me from a position of sympathy to empathy, and anger that I wasn't educated more about this on the right way to handle this disease, even lied to, and prevented me from getting preventative care for it. And what was profoundly emphasized to me today, something that I believe you had said about the inextricable link between science, health, and our spiritual faith. It broke my heart to hear those trained with the slave mentality, thinking they'd be spared by God for their services to master, and not demanding compensation or reward for themselves, and then perishing, as that's not how science works. Given that many of these disparities are fueled by medical racism and a lack of culturally competent care, and the absence of targeted public health initiatives, I just had a question for the panel about what we see the role, not only as first responders, but also as faith leaders, as people in these communities, to not just treat, but actively dismantle. And I know that we're not going to answer all these questions today, but.
No, I mean it when I say the audience is my co-facilitator, and I like that question a lot. And maybe someone wants to take it on, or maybe they want to let it float. It looks like Katie wants to respond.
I can take part of that. So the first Black professional nurse graduated in 1793. I mean, in 1879. So it was well after this event. But leading up to that, and even after, and her name is Mary Mahoney, and even after she graduated, she was the only nurse trained in a hospital. There were about 50-some nurses that went through, and she was one of 4 that graduated. And yet, she was never able to practice in a hospital. The white nurses practiced in the hospital. She was banished to work in communities to take what she can get, and in some cases, work as a slave. So I want to make sure to level set this, where even though there's an impression that there's this a little bit of foolishness, if you will, in thinking that you could be saved because, thoughts and prayers is going to get you through, because, because I always talk about when I do talks, and people say hope is not a strategy. Hope is a strategy when you have nothing else. And in a lot of cases for these folks, it was hope and faith that carried them through. So I think that is partly at play. And the other thing is that they were trying to figure out ways to earn a living. So you put those two things together, of course, fools are going to rush in. And I think we need to be mindful of the time and the setting and the conditioning that happened where black bodies were commoditized. So I think that is part of what we need to understand about what was playing in the minds of these folks. Because, and you know, as much as they say, you know, street talk, game knows game, struggle knows struggle. And that's part of the reason why a lot of black people took pity and supported impoverished white people, because they saw their struggle in those people. So I just want to put that in the room to address that.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate both the question and what you've said, just complexifying the conversation. Like, we're not here to tie bows on this conversation or make it neat or easily digestible. The more complicated it gets, I think the richer our connection to each other and the material is. I also want to say I just really appreciated about what you brought into the room. I was waiting for someone to sort of pivot and say, what we have on display in this play or this text are health inequities or disparities in 1793, the devaluation of, you know, black life, the erasure of black death, the erasure of black suffering, and here are some of the ways it applies to all the other types of health inequities we have in our culture and our society today. And I appreciate you bringing them into the room, because we've heard a couple people have spoken to it so far, but to have a lived example where you speak to it in the room is even more powerful. So thank you so much. I see your hand back here. I promised Keith I'd go to him next, and he's someone I can't say no to, so I'm going to go over here first real quick.
Well, thanks. I didn't think I would have anything to add, because I want to just applaud the performance. Hearing it made me realize that that Matthew Carey thinks he understands human nature. And what was really profound is to hear the description of human nature as characterized by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. A very different story about how people behave under stress. And the phrase that, I mean, read this so many times, but the phrase that really stuck out to me is when Absalom Jones said, or Richard Allen, they both wrote this together, said, "An ill name is easy to give, but once given, right, is hard to," and they're really trying to explain like human nature to Matthew Carey, and he clearly doesn't ever get that, right? So that's the kind of deep insight that they have among many things that they had to say.
I think that's so powerful, Keith, and I appreciate you as an expert on this material being present with what you were surprised by. I was surprised hearing it read out loud and thinking about how actors reading it makes the stakes clearer. And what's at stake is we're in Philadelphia, we're at the birth of the United States as a nation, we're in the nation's capital, there's a small free black community, people born into slavery who've liberated themselves by purchasing their freedom, and their reputation has been dragged through the mud by this publisher. But it's not just about their reputation, it's about the possibility of what's before them being completely destroyed by libelous, slanderous remarks that stain them and their reputation. And so the forcefulness with which they make the refutation and the forcefulness with which they demonstrate their humanity, not rhetorically, but just through their deeds, is the refutation. But it's not an academic exercise. I mean, it is, the stakes are, they couldn't be higher for this community at this particular moment in Philadelphia. There's a hand back there, and I promise I'll come to you, Josepha, next, and then I know you've been waiting for some time. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I just have 2 points, and thank you to the actors for a great presentation. The first point for me was throughout the text, throughout the reading, I was grappling with me being a Christian and being called to be the hands and feet of God and serve others, but also the context in which they're serving, where they were previously thought of as servants and treated as such without any recognition for their own humanity. So the anger over them having to step back into this role, whether volunteered or asked to. So I was grappling with that throughout the text. And then the second point that struck me was how much Carey's response is reminiscent of the culture we have today, where people listen to respond rather than listening to understand. You can clearly see that Carey read the response, but all you took away from was, I said you did a great job. I said that you did all these great things. I said some, and Carey not understanding that in that context, that saying some means everyone. It doesn't negate the, saying some doesn't negate the good that, excuse me, saying some does negate the good that they did at that time.
Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate being in a church. We're doing something in a library tomorrow, and the set and setting always frames the conversation differently, do sacred and secular, but acknowledging that we're in a sacred space and that running through this are these two faith leaders and this question of how do you stay true to your faith and live up to the calling of your faith while simultaneously protecting yourself and your community from those who might take advantage of the selflessness of your acts? I mean, or how do you square your faith with a culture that claims to share the values that they're at the center of your faith, but actually it's all words? Or, I mean, I don't know if I'm phrasing it right, but I feel like bringing faith or your own, how the text challenges or it aligns with your own questions around faith in this culture today, I think is really important to bring into the room, something we rarely get to do in sort of federal or municipal communities. So it's good to be doing it here. Josepha, you've been waiting for a long time, and it's been a long time since we've seen you. You've been doing hundreds of events, and we met Josepha during a project called Theater of War Frontline, when we were trying to do performances for people on the front lines of COVID. But I won't steal your thunder, Josepha. Over to you. What resonated with you tonight?
Yeah. Oh, I have no thunder. If anything, I'm humbled to hear the comments of the panelists and the attendees in the church. I'm learning so much. And one of the key things that I took away is, having learned about this plague, the yellow fever, as a historical event, it just feels like something you read in a book. Hearing this read by your cast and the production made it so contemporary and made it applicable to what we're going through right now. And I really heard what one of your panelists said about the need for a scapegoat. If anything, I think that the current pandemic is not any of these medical, it is expressed in these medical crises that we're having that are affecting large populations throughout our country as well as the world. But I think the main pandemic right now is racism in the US, and that this is what serves the purpose of the scapegoating, whether it's a population such as a migrant population, whether it's a specific ethnicity or gender politics. And I think the question that you had asked in terms of why is there this war of words, I never thought about it till you said it, is that the pamphlets are social media, and the social media of today, why is this a war being fought in social media? We're getting a constant barrage of this information from, whether it's the White House, whether it's news sources, whether it's Twitter or X, whatever. The main reason why there is such an incredible pressure to control the media is because whoever wins the media gets to write the history and rewrite history. That going forward, as well as what's already been recorded. We're seeing this right now when you're looking for government pages that used to be of social services, of things that people need for every day, for care, for Medicare, for anything. There's information, even the HR for the government. It's hard to find information. We've become so distracted by the politics of discord that we're not able to pay attention to the absolute disruption of everything that we've always come to depend on as always being there in our government. And I think the main pandemic that we're dealing with right now is racism. We don't think of it that way because we don't think of it as a physical, mental disease. And I think that if we don't start realizing that, we are going to continue to become more and more fractured. And with regard to that, I think that this activity, participating in it, and the fact that Theater of War is doing these as a public service, I think this is the refutation to what is happening. And the more that we can participate in greater numbers, in more frequency, open minds, and open hearts, I think this is the refutation. And for that, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. I really appreciate that. You know, my soapbox about that is just simply, thank you so much, is that you know, would that we could scale what we're doing right now to actually be comparable to social media. We need social media that are capacious enough to hold the complexity and the emotions at the center of the conversations we have to be having with each other, but the media that we have are not holding that space. So my colleague Marjolaine, who's running the Zoom in the back, hacked Zoom to bring people all over the world into dialogue with people in physical spaces. This is not what the Zoom was designed for. It's like a corporate communications tool. And yet I think it intimates or hints at, to Joseph's point, what we really could be doing. That there's a possibility of direct democracy in our dialogue here in this room, and where we don't know who's going to speak next, and they have a right to speak, and we hear them out, and we stay in the room, and we listen to each other's perspectives. And so that's my soapbox. I see your hand back there. I've denied someone here the mic for a really long time, but I'll come back to you in just 1 second, sir. I'll go here and then come right over there. Not denied, but just made you wait.
I'm happy to wait my turn. Everyone else gets to talk. That's part of this. In going back to outcomes and the disturbing similarities to the present social media environment and Matthew Carey's response, I was disturbed by the all too familiar response that Matthew Carey has when he's confronted with his harmful and incorrect statement, to immediately start doubling down and minimizing. And it struck me most on the second read through as he's reading through and pointing, saying, no, look, I said that you all were good. I said that it wasn't everyone. I didn't do anything really that harmful. The very simple point struck me that, of course, when he actually says nice things about the Black community and what they're doing to help, he says that second. He makes his harmful statement first. He makes a harmful, incorrect statement first, and then says the kind thing second. And it's simple, but by the time anyone would get to that second statement, they're already stuck with that first incorrect statement. So I was struck by those 2 points. And then, of course, as I said, that all too familiar minimalization. There's no ownership of the harm. There's no apology. Is one to be expected? I mean, hopefully, but yeah, the lack of ownership, the lack of apology, the doubling down on the harm. And then, of course, the fact that second doubling down harmful statement will once again go out to so many people. And both the modeling of behavior on that grand scale, and then also the secondary harm to the first harm that's already been done. And again, the way that mirrors how we see this play out on social media so frequently, again, with that minimalizing in the face of you've done harm.
That's all really powerful, and I'm just in service of the fact that we're going to run out of time soon. She has a mic, and I'll come right back to you. Go ahead, ma'am. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm just thoroughly grateful to be here. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. So many threads were woven here for me. So I'm a researcher, and I'm a researcher of what's called real-world evidence, and that means a lot. I always ascribe to the notion of, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And, obviously that rings true here today from the narratives that we've heard. And when I think about evidence, I think about it in various forms. It could just be data we collect about, numbers. It could be in the form of narratives, stories. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Back then, what would have been, commentary like we heard today is what we see today in the form of social media en masse. And I think a lot of the work that I do as a researcher, resonates a lot today. I do a lot of work. In fact, I'm here with my sister, AKA one of my colleagues, who is a former president of a local chapter of the National Black Nurses Association. Excellent. We've done a lot of work together looking at what motivates Black nurses to share their data with researchers, specifically for purposes of conducting genetics research. Go figure what you hear today. There are lots of concerns about how is my information going to be used. Is this going to put me in even more harm if someone tries to make a case around genetic exceptionalism with respect to my race, or by proxy of my racial expression or identity. That obviously, again, is something that we see it just happens over and over again. It rhymes with time, or rhymes against history, or rhymes with history, as you've said. But I want to in my work, I also think a lot about what motivates people to share their information with researchers, especially health information. And you even pose that question, what motivated this refutation? And one interesting observation that I found in research that I've done, I did a survey, and I found within my data, after running all my statistics, that individuals just in the general population are more likely or more willing to share their health information with researchers in the event they've had their reputation negatively affected as a result of information that they've shared online, or information that's just out there about them online. Wow. And so, seeing that quantitatively in my data, and then hearing this refutation, I'm like, well, this is exactly what this is. They're sharing this information because they're trying to correct a narrative about themselves that's been spewed out in the media for everyone to see, put on display, but that needs to be refuted. Yeah. The stories need to be told, and that's where the real-world evidence happens, and that's where we can come in and enlighten ourselves around our own behaviors. Our tendencies to confuse anecdotes with actual evidence. Obviously the yellow fever, these are all anecdotes. Oh, Black people can't get it, and therefore, no, that's really also evidence of us just seeing bad science happening back then as well. And so, again, it's really surreal to see how we just keep repeating or rhyming, as you say, with history. And I if we have a pill that we can take to fix that, that'd be great.
Yeah,
or I think this is the pill.
Yeah, thank you. We're not medicine, we're not a cult, but we kind of sound like one sometimes, and I appreciate you acknowledge, and I appreciate coming from a researcher. We'll go back there, sir. You've been waiting for some time, and then after that, we're going to go to Diana, who's been waiting, who's a paramedic, and I'm really glad she joined us. And then we'll have time for one last person to have the perfect last word that'll sum everything up into one perfect statement. So, sir, we'll find out who that person is in a second, but over to you, sir.
Well, I think what we have been doing here tonight is using a lot of euphemisms and malaprops and not calling exactly what the problem is. And the problem is to have an equivalent to what is yellow fever today. It has 5 letters. You figure that out.
Okay, I like that. I like answering questions with riddles that only a certain percentage of the audience understands, but I think it's that's an excellent way of responding. I really appreciate that. Diana, thanks for your patience. What resonated with you tonight?
What resonated with me and what seems true is the person who spoke to evidence and science. And as a scientist and somebody who is interested in medicine, I realized when we were having this conversation, I didn't know very much about yellow fever. And so I looked it up, and I realized it's spread by mosquitoes. And that's the thing that's missing from this conversation, is we were pointing fingers in all the wrong places for the cure and for the treatment and mistreatment and the reason for it spreading. And it comes down to mosquitoes. And there's a vaccine. And I'm not saying that that's the answer to everything, but I'm saying that by really exploring the evidence and the science, that's maybe perhaps a way out of the pricklier things that, like, we just get stuck on.
Thank you so much, Diane. I really appreciate that. You wear a lot of hats, and it's great to piggyback off the researcher and bring us back to the epidemiology of COVID, I mean, not just of COVID, but of yellow fever. I guess I'm listening and thinking to what has been said so far, and it feels like we talked about yellow fever as a disease, and then someone talked about racism as a disease, and then we talked about how Carey was sort of casting about for all the reasons people got sick and didn't get sick, and in that section of his narrative, he then made those claims about Jones and Allen and the Black community that were sort of racially charged and repugnant. And I hear you bringing us back to, that maybe science is one of the ways out of our ignorance.
But can I say something about that? There, with the movement right now with race, the DEI, anti-DEI movement, what's running up very close to that is the anti-science.
Anti-science, yeah.
The anti-science movement is very real, and those two are woven together, and it's the same people.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of the things that are happening right now with vaccines not becoming a thing anymore. The CDC shut down its campaign for flu vaccines, and flu is raging. This is the highest rate of flu since 15 years ago. So I think we need to be mindful that the anti-science movement is also a thing. And we talk about evidence, but today there's evidence and there's evidence. The same, you go to a local hearing to talk about the fact that we need to make sure we have safe water. There's someone that's right next to you that's going to show you evidence about how a little lead in your water is good for you. Right? So, and it's the same Secretary, Kennedy, that talked about how, Black people don't need to be on the same vaccine schedule as white people. So, and he has evidence. He does. So we need to be mindful that there is different types of evidence, and because of a lot of the misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, no one knows what to believe anymore. That's the situation that we're in.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'd like to acknowledge that the actor playing Matthew Carey just passed the mic over here to our representative from the National Black Nurses Association. So.
Actually, that's Katie, too.
Yeah. Katie as well. Oh, Katie? Yeah. Katie to Katie. Yeah, thank you
Sorry.
so much. Yeah.
No, I was just going to make mention to your comment about, while we're trying to think about, what's the problem, who's to blame, while we stay in that bowl of, what's happening now. One thing that we in nursing, we nurses always think about is what outcome do we want despite the circumstances? It doesn't matter what kind of patients we're taking care of, whether it's a patient in the emergency room, patient in the surgical center, it's a patient in our critical care areas, whether it's a pandemic or it's a wellness clinic. What outcome do we want? And if we stay close to, no matter while we can't answer all of those questions right now, and while science will help us to answer those questions as time goes by, it's still about what do we want? What outcome do we want in this moment, whether it's for a person or a populace?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So maybe there's someone here who has something burning within them to say, or feels like there's a hand right here. No pressure, sir, to sum everything up into one perfect statement.
Thank you. I'm not going to sum everything up. I will say that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And I hope that this event tonight will help us learn from history so that we don't repeat it. And I want to also add that this is perfect timing because just up on the Hill, the House of Representatives is debating whether to cut people off Medicaid so they can extend tax breaks for billionaires. And we have to stop that.
That's a pretty good last word. I also appreciate that we're here in DC at a time of great discord, obviously. And that people have been forthright and direct in their positions, not necessarily just political, but their positions as human beings, as members of a community. Charlene, do you want to say something maybe to bring us on home?
Hello, my name is Charlene. I have been a nurse for many, many decades. I have stopped doing the math. Math is not good. Math is no longer my friend. One thing I was thinking about that really hit me was the presentation of how each individual presented their viewpoint. One individual can perhaps be loud and adamant and enunciate everything, and just being that loud person validates their point. Whereas you have other individuals that may be of a different ethnicity who cannot actually present their point in the same way because it's not listened to. The minute they become, or they try to present their voice in that manner, it becomes invalidated and no one listens. As a nurse, I had the opportunity of speaking with an individual I met. She was an older Jewish woman in her 90s. She was born in the 1930s. She expressed frustration with what's going on today. And her words were, "I've seen this all before. It's happening again. Why isn't anybody angry? What is going on?" That pretty much says it. What she said resonates with me every single day. Met her last week, and she was even talking about how in the 1950s, her mom took her to Planned Parenthood to get fitted for whatever. And she said, like, there's some places now that they can't have that. This is a 93-year-old Jewish woman who is frustrated with what is going on today. I want it to change. I would love for it to change. I don't know. I don't know.
That may be a more fitting last word. I thank you, Charlene, for always being here. Charlene's going to come tomorrow and bring another group of people. She's always there for us. She was a part of our project, The Nurse Antigone, where we toured online, and then ultimately New York, production of Antigone, where the chorus in Sophocles' play was played by nurses. And then we wrestled with questions during the pandemic, and as we were sort of coming up out of it, of the relevance of that play to the present moment. And she rose to the ranks of being an actress in the chorus to ultimately co-facilitating a conversation with me about the first Black Union nurse, Susie King Taylor, whose memoir we performed for a group of nurses down in Savannah, Georgia, and online. And so I'm delighted to have you here with us and tomorrow. There's a lot of people I just want to thank really quickly before I close things out, and I promise I'll let you guys go home on this cold, blustery Friday night. I want to thank the Greenwall Foundation. I want to thank Ebenezer United Methodist Church. I want to thank Keith Whaleu, who's been an interlocutor in this, Alyssa Lassiter Whaleu, who introduced us, sister-in-law of Keith, to Reverend Jenkins, the pastor with a degree in costume design, who opened his doors immediately to us. Sasha White at Johns Hopkins University, who suggested these texts. Joshua Sharfstein introduced me to Sasha White, who's one of the deans of public health. Cinda Rushton, colleague and friend, who's always brings so much light into our work. Charlene Lass, Brían Jenkins, Jen Etheridge, Jess Mitchell, they're all folks who work here at the church. Our tech team, Zephan Blacksburg and all of his crew, and of course my colleague Marjolaine Goldsmith, who's been running behind the curtain the whole time, the Zoom, and makes so much of this possible. I want to thank these panelists, who I was worried about having 7, but it turned out to be a beautiful chorus of voices that made tonight's conversation possible. And of course, our actors, with one last big round of applause for their performance tonight. It's been an absolute honor to be with you for the premiere of this project. We'll be taking the next one to the Martin Luther King Jr. Library tomorrow. We hope to bring it to Baltimore and Philadelphia in the weeks and months ahead. We hope you'll join us either on Zoom or in person for iterations and keep the conversation going. Thank you for helping us to understand these texts and launch this project here in this beautiful space together. It's been an honor being with you. If we had one message to deliver to you, it's simply this. If you related to anything that's been said in the room or on the stage, you're not alone in this room, you're not alone across the country and the world, as evidenced by the conversation we've had, but not finished. Most critically, you're not alone across time. And after an early performance of our work, of one of our projects, someone stood up and answered a question I often ask: why do you think the playwright wrote the text? And this person stood up and she said, what has become our motto: I think he wrote the text, I think Jones and Allen wrote the text to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. I hope we did a little of both for everyone here tonight. Be well. We'll see you again soon. Good night.